Thank you. Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing? I actually said this in the breakout last night. I'm going to say it to you today. Do whatever you need to feel comfortable and to be engaged this morning. If you need to lay on the floor, if you need to stand on the back, if you need to do somersaults across the back, do what you need to do to fully engage, okay? Great. So as he mentioned, I love kids in student ministry, and I have been on staff for several decades leading that capacity. And over the years, our team began to realize that we did a really great job in creating these fun environments and welcome environments for kids and students to come and know Jesus and grow in their faith. But in August of 2012, as we met, we realized that we were actually called to be a welcoming place to all kids, no matter what their abilities were, no matter what they'd experienced in their past. So we began talking and training and reading and most of all listening. And as we did that, we changed. And as we changed, families started coming to check us out. But when they came, you could tell that they were very hesitant to tell us about their child. And the reason for that is because they hadn't always felt welcome at other places. So I believe the biggest opportunity and challenge for us in the local church is, what do we do with the kids that we don't know what to do with? How do we respond to them in healthy and helpful manners? These are kids that have behaviors that we don't understand, and we just don't have the tools to respond. So I've had such a great time with you guys yesterday. It's such an honor to gather with like-minded friends and people. Well, you're just people. I'm not saying you're not my friends. It's just I haven't met you to call you a friend yet. But to gather together, to come up with new tools and strategies, and to share ideas with each other on how we can all be churches and be churches that are safe places for everybody to meet Jesus, meet some new friends, grow in their faith, and belong. So a friend recently shared a story with me. She was at church, and as she walked into the lobby, her child, and I'll just call him Robert, had a major meltdown. And so this mom sat right in the middle of the church lobby with her child. And the reason that she did that is because her kid, when he was having a meltdown, would often yell, "You're hurting me." So she stopped in this public place so people could see she was not hurting him. You see, Robert looked like a typical kid, but over the first 6.5 years of his life, he bounced from family member to family member. And then he went into foster care. And then he went into my friend's home where he was eventually adopted. And as she sat there, she said people would walk by and some would kind of look at her and then step up their pace a little bit. And she felt so alone sitting there in the lobby. And then somebody stopped and said, "I'm just going to stay here with you." Somebody else stopped and said, "Can I get some water for you and your screaming child?" Another friend then came by and said, "Hey, I'm going to go ahead and check your kids in to the kids area while you stay here." And she said the people that did that, when they did that, she said, "I felt seen and understood." And that was huge to her. These simple acts of kindness made a huge difference. And many of us in this room have been there, sitting on the floor with a kid having a meltdown who's communicating with us in the only way that they know how. Or maybe we're trying to remove a child from an activity that they love, and they are expressing in a very loud and enthusiastic way how much they do not want to leave. And as that happens, we may feel judged by onlookers who actually have no understanding of our story or our kid's story. So there we are, trying to comfort our child while we're also needing comfort. And when I think back to those friends in the church lobby that sat and brought water and offered to check my friends' kids into the kids area, they noticed somebody in need. They were aware. So rather than walk by, they got curious. They're thinking, how can I help? They were humble. They didn't assume that they knew what was going on. They didn't make judgments. And instead, they did something. They offered tangible support. More of that, please, right? Wouldn't you like to see more of that in your church? But unfortunately, as I work with church leaders who are struggling to respond to challenging behavior with kids and students, I often see a desire to fix the behavior or find the sin and address that. I've been asked in a number of different ways by a number of different children's leaders, basically, what do you do when a parent thinks their kid has special needs, but really there's a sin issue that needs to be addressed? I try to watch what my face is communicating because it's not kindness. Because let me be clear, most often it's not a sin issue. It's a kid who's overwhelmed, does not have the coping strategies to manage with what is going on. They may have needs or disabilities that affect their behavior. So I believe instead of moving straight to judgment, saying that it's a sin, let's connect, let's bring water, let's sit on the floor, let's be curious, let's be a friend, let's be kind. And as followers of Jesus, we want to be more like him, right? Does anybody in this room, would you like to be more like Jesus? Very good. If your neighbor didn't raise their hand, then why don't you pray with them and speak with them after this? So we want to respond to Jesus like Jesus responds to them, right? So how does Jesus respond? A great way to find that is to go to the Bible. So I'm going to go to Matthew 19:14, and it says, Jesus said, let the little children come to me, the clean and compliant ones, the ones who are able to move from room to room on their own with no assistance, the children who are able to articulate their needs verbally with words, the children who always do what's asked the first time. Don't keep them away. The kingdom of heaven belongs to people like these. Is that what Jesus said? No, he did not qualify what kind of children we're supposed to welcome. So based on that, I'm assuming that we're to welcome all children. But, you know the images that hang in so many of our church halls of Jesus with the really clean, compliant kids? The ones that are sitting there just looking at Jesus, hanging on every word. I believe that those set up unrealistic expectations of how children act. And so, after coming home from a conference, I was complaining to my daughter-in-law, Haley. And I said, that is not how I believe it was with Jesus and the kids. So, she created these images for me. Because I believe this is a much more realistic expectation. I believe that when Jesus is with kids, there are spills and tears. There are kids under the table and kids standing on chairs. There are kids that are stimming. There are kids that are braiding hair. There are kids that are laughing. There are tears. And there's also kids that are double dipping on the goldfish crackers. So, besides not having realistic expectations, I think we have another problem. Research has been done that shows that about a third of families who have kids with disabilities have left at least one church because their child was not included or welcomed. And I'm not okay with that. Are you? Are you? No. And in recent years, the research has shown that these kids are the kids that have been the typical focus of disability ministry, you know, those with intellectual and physical disabilities, they are not the kids who are being excluded. The ones who are being excluded have less visible disabilities, like autism, anxiety, depression, ADHD, oppositional defiance disorder, and others. Disabilities that affect their behavior. And Karen Purvis, who was a pioneer in working with kids who've experienced trauma, says behavior is the language of children who have lost their voice. Many kids, like Robert, who is having trouble in the church lobby. They have disabilities that aren't visible. So because of their past experience, their brain is wired for survival. They feel unsafe even when they're with us, and we know that they're safe, but they don't feel that way. So they're communicating their fears, their anxieties, their needs, their feelings to us, but they're not using their words, they're using their behavior. But rather than trying to listen to the behavior, often we tend to go straight to discipline and correction, eliminating the behavior. Instead, what I believe we need to do is to stop and to listen to what they're saying to us through their behavior, the only language that may be currently accessible to them in the moment. So I think another way to respond is I'm going to give us 4 steps. And first, be aware of the people around us. Like the people in the church lobby that were aware that there was a mother in need sitting with a child who was trying to communicate. Second, be curious about the behavior, what is underneath the behavior we're seeing. Rather than walk by, let's consider being supportive and inclusive. How can we be a friend? And then be humble and open to new ideas. Don't assume that we know what's going on. Pray and listen to the Lord. Seek guidance from Him. And then take everything that we've learned and observed and do something. Sit on the floor, bring water, mow somebody's lawn, go shoot basketball. The ways that we can do something are endless. You've seen the stats. People with disabilities are much less likely to attend church than the general population. And you've heard the stories. Families asked to leave a church. Based on these statistics and stories, I believe it's time for a change. But it's not about changing those who have disabilities. It's about the church, the people in the church, us changing. Decades ago, I took the less desirable approach, and I was working with some 5 fourth grade boys, and I was trying very, very hard to change their behavior. Very, very hard. Because when these 5 kids would show up, the destruction level would go up, the chaos level would go up. So, if I can be totally honest, when these boys didn't show up, there were tears shed, tears of joy that they weren't there. So, our leadership team prayed for these boys that we identified as a problem and we identified as troublemakers. We prayed that they would change. We prayed that they would respond to our discipline. We prayed that they would obey. And after months of this, nothing changed. They still tore up stuff and they ruined our great plans. At least that's the way we perceived it. So one day in a leadership meeting, one of the leaders said, maybe we should pray that we change. And I said, what? Us? She said, yeah, I think we need to pray that our hearts change towards these 5 boys. So as we did that, we agreed to do something physical that was a representation of our prayers. So when they would arrive, we would greet them joyfully. Even if we didn't feel joy, we would greet them joyfully by name. And we would look them in the eye. And then we would exchange some physical touch that they were okay with. A fist bump, a high five. One kid liked to bump on the forehead, really enthusiastically. Like, whoa. As we did that, we started to see the strengths in these boys. They were leaders. The kids in the room were watching them. Also, they had high energy and were enthusiastic. Now, sometimes their enthusiasm was geared towards less desirable activities, but nevertheless, they were enthusiastic. And they were excited to be at church. They wanted to be there. So as we prayed and engaged in more positive ways, our hearts began to change. We began to deeply love each of these boys. We actually missed them when they were gone. We realized that they were not troublemakers. They were treasures. They weren't problems. They were precious. They were children of God. They were teaching us things. There were few places that they felt welcome. Several of them bounced from home to home. And they all struggled in school and with relationships. But during this time, church became a safe place for them. And I had the great honor to baptize several of them. We grew to love them. And while we initially prayed for God to change them, God used them to change us. I was talking to a church leader a couple weeks ago at a conference, and she had a kid who, in her words, was a disruption. So I'm aware, okay, she's got this kid that she thinks is a disruption. So I got curious, and I started asking her questions. And this child was nonverbal, but would, she said, shriek during children's church. I said, okay. Are there particular times during children's church that she shrieks? She goes, yeah, whenever the music comes on. She is just shrieking. I said, okay, I wonder what that could be. It's only during the music? And she said, yeah, pretty much just during the music. I said, okay, I wonder what that could be. Like, what are other, like, so what's that time for? She's like, it's worship. I said, okay, well, I wonder what she's doing. And tears started falling on her face. She said, I'm trying to get her to stop, but I wonder if she's actually modeling to us uninhibited worship. I said, yeah, I think she might be. So this leader, she was aware this child was actually hard to miss due to her enthusiastic worship. Then she got curious about what could be behind the behavior, though as she described, shrieking. Then she was humble and open. Maybe it's not a distraction. Maybe it's this child worshiping. Then the leader decided to do something. She came up with a plan. She decided that she was going to go back to her church. And in kids' church, she was going to invite the other kids to worship in whatever way they felt called to, whether it be dancing or screaming or doing their hands, rather than dictate how we should worship. What we believe about the kids, if we believe a kid's a distraction, it's going to change the way we interact with them. It could be kids in our church, kids on the street, kids in the grocery store. When we see a child acting out, maybe they're really reaching out to us. They've got a need, and they need our help in identifying it and meeting that. Maybe the behavior is actually a connection issue. The 5 fourth grade boys that I mentioned, who were often viewed as acting out, they were desperate for connection. They weren't getting connection in other places. They were getting discipline and criticism. They were reaching out, looking for an acceptance and love. Ephesians 1:5 says, so he decided long ago to adopt us. He adopted us as his children. What if we believed that Ephesians 1:5 applied to every person in front of us? What if we looked at every person through that lens? As a child of God, fearfully and wonderfully made, a gift to us from above. I love this quote. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. And this applies to more than daisies and roses. What if, instead of trying to change the kid, we work to change our environment? So they're all fully welcome, loved, and included. What if we looked around and were more intentional, being aware of the people around us? What if we approached every person with curiosity, seeking to understand and get to know them? And as we listen to them, what if we were humble, knowing that we don't have all the answers? And then what if we did something? We took action. Be a friend, be inclusive. Invite them to serve with us. Invite them out to coffee. As I wrap up, I want to share a story of Father Joe, who's a great model to all of us. He had a child in his church who had autism and was preparing for First Communion. And Father Joe was aware of the challenges that First Communion might present to this child. You know, First Communion, you got a lot of people, you got scratching new clothes. And so he got curious and he asked the family, what would be best for your child? Such a simple question. And as he asked that, he was then humble. He was ready to hear their ideas. And they shared what they thought would be challenges for him. So Father Joe did something. He came up with a plan. This sweet child had his First Communion midweek with only his invited guests. And Father Joe created a program, just like every other kid got on the weekend First Communion date. Father Joe ordered flowers. Father Joe did something. And now this child is more comfortable and he participates in communion during Mass with the rest of his church community. Father Joe didn't make this kid change. Instead, Father Joe identified the need and then changed the environment to meet this child's needs. Father Joe did something. More of us need to be like Father Joe, asking, what do you need? What does your child need? So may we all be more intentional and be aware of the people around us. Being curious about who they are, their interests and their needs. And may we stay humble and open to new ideas. Praying for inspiration and instruction from the Lord. And may we all do something to make our churches, our small groups, our serving teams, a place for people to find Jesus, find friends, find their place to belong. Thank you.